second prominent theme in Native American policy following the Civil War was warfare. The so-called Indian Wars waged off and on between 1854 and 1890. The initial spark was a fairly innocuous incident. A young Sioux warrior found a cow wandering on the Oregon Trail and killed it, innocently enough. Whites in the area thought that an appropriate punishment for that act was to kill two of the Sioux Indians in the area, and this quickly escalated into an orchestrated war between the two sides. Now, when we think of the Indian Wars, we should not think of massive, protracted campaigns involving thousands of soldiers on both sides. In fact, they were very sporadic. There were periods of months, even years, in which there was virtually no violence between the two sides at all. But those stretches of relative peace would be punctuated by episodes involving one side or the other making an attack and then a retaliation. The Indian Wars themselves certainly escalate as we reach the final few years of this period, approaching 1890. But prior to that, they were typically very small engagements, again, waged only off and on, sporadically. I'll give you a few examples of the kinds of episodes that punctuated these long stretches of relative peace. One of them is the infamous Sand Creek Massacre, or Fort Lyon Massacre, of the year 1864. This took place in Colorado and involved a group of Cheyenne Indians who were led by a man named Black Kettle, and the American representative in this case, whose name was Colonel John Chivington. The Cheyenne had been pursued by American forces for several months leading up to this, and eventually Black Kettle and his men surrendered to Chivington. "We are tired of fleeing and enduring this, so we are at your mercy. Tell us what to do." And so they surrendered to Chivington at Fort Lyon. Well, Chivington actually didn't know what to do with these Native Americans. And so he began wiring back word of what had happened to his leadership in the East. But if we recall what was happening in the East in the year 1864, we are in the middle of the Civil War. And in fact, 1864 was an incredibly harsh and brutal and violent year in the war. And so leadership back in the East wasn't terribly concerned with what happened to a few hundred Native Americans at this far-flung little outpost in Colorado. And so eventually Chivington, not sure what to do, wringing his hands over several weeks, finally, on November 29th, 1864, ordered a group of 700 heavily armed soldiers out into the camp, which at that point was completely peaceful and unarmed, and commenced to slaughtering the Cheyenne Indians who were there. This is the picture you see at the bottom of your screen. Some 200 defenseless Native Americans were killed in this massacre, as it is known. Now, this was not typical of the way Americans treated Native Americans during this time, but these sorts of things did happen, and you can certainly understand how Native Americans grew to be distrustful of American representatives when things like this did occasionally happen. Native Americans surrender, trusting the white officers to whom they surrendered, and then they turn around and are slaughtered. So why not continue fighting and continue to resist under those circumstances? Now, for the most part, the ensuing years during the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant were relatively peaceful between Native Americans and the American government. The most common method that we see during this period are those treaties drawn up between American Indian agents and the Native Americans. And again, these were often lubricated with alcohol and were frequently not honored by the Americans once they got Native Americans to agree to them. But occasionally things did break out into violence. And another of the famous examples of this is the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, which occurred in the Black Hills of South Dakota in Sioux territory. Now, what happened in 1876 was that gold was discovered on these lands, which had been designated to the Sioux. They had already agreed to confine themselves to this reservation, albeit a large stretch of land. But with the discovery of gold, white prospectors began streaming into the area in search of riches, and one of their number was a man named Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, a name now etched in history. So Custer enters this story as little more than a prospector. He is looking for gold. But of course the Sioux resisted this influx of white settlers into their territory, and so we began to anticipate that there would be an armed clash between the sides. Well, Custer foolishly marshaled a troop of about 200 men and led them into battle against 4,000 battle-tested and well-armed Sioux warriors at what is known as the Battle of Little Bighorn. The results, of course, are well known. Custer and every one of his men were killed in this battle. It was a wipeout for the Sioux warriors. Now, understanding the full context of the story, we can be sympathetic with the Sioux for resenting whites, first of all for confining them to the reservation, and then for impeding onto the territory that they had been given. But do you expect that that's how people viewed it at that time? Of course not. No, the American media and white civilization all over the country only grew to despise Native Americans even more. And we see the picture at the right, which was drawn in the aftermath of this. What we see is what appears to be a proud, upright American soldier who has shot a vicious Native American who is not even depicted as a human being in this picture, but rather half beast in the picture. And he has carried out a scalping of the victim who's laying on the ground. And so the aftermath of Little Bighorn was outrage from the American government and white society in the East. And so what followed became a much more aggressive and systematic campaign of war and battles to force Native Americans to submit to the reservations. In the years after the Battle of Little Bighorn, Native American tribes were systematically rounded up and attacked and forced onto ever-shrinking reservations. In the final years of our period, though, the process became even more ruthless against Native Americans in the West. The most notorious act, at least of nonviolence, was called the Dawes Severalty Act, which was passed by the American government in 1887. If you notice your definition on the screen, this is an 1887 law that started the breakup of reservations by offering Native Americans allotments of 160 acres of reservation land to encourage them to become independent farmers. And so the American government, by virtue of this act, is going to break up the collective reservations, which at times numbered in the millions of acres or hundreds of thousands of acres. And rather, they're going to break them up into individual allotments of 160 acres. This is basically applying the Homestead Act to Native American reservations. Now, if you are a single Native American and the government is giving you 160 acres of land, that sounds like a large plot to be given to each individual, but bear in mind that Native Americans, for the most part, had a very collective view on property and ownership, and individual ownership meant nothing to them. And so the upshot of this is that as much as 90% of reservation land would then be taken back to the American government, and the Native Americans themselves were left with only 10% of their previous land in these individual plots of 160 acres. At that point, the American government then turned around and offered out the rest of the land to Western settlers and homesteaders, which we talked about in the previous lecture. And that's what you see at the bottom of this page. Indian land for sale, perfect title, possession within 30 days, fine lands in the West, and so on. These were reservation lands that had now been taken away from the Native Americans and would be given to the homesteaders and settlers. White treatment of the Native Americans is now seen as one of the real black marks on American history, a low point in our history. So it's worth asking for a moment, why did white Americans believe that they had a right to do this? Why did they feel like they were right in mistreating the Native Americans and taking their lands? Well, let's look for a moment at the conflicting quotes on the screen. The one on the left representing a view of the white settlers. William Blackmore in 1877 wrote, "The Indians will be eliminated by the progress of the more energetic and aggressive Anglo-Saxon, a higher and more civilized race." And Sitting Bull on the right offers a conflicting view, also in 1877. "The white men claim this mother of ours, the earth, for their own use, and fence their neighbors away from her, and deface her with their buildings and their refuse. They destroy all who are in their path." So if we look at Blackmore's quote on the left, there's a hint of Andrew Jackson in it. The quote that I read earlier rings familiar. Why does the white man think he has a right to do this? Well, the Indians, Native Americans, are not using the land properly. The Anglo-Saxon is more energetic and aggressive. We see the word progress. And the last few words very telling. They are a higher and more civilized race. Now, of course, in our modern context, we view this as very charged and even racist language. Who says that the white man is more civilized? What does that even mean? Native Americans had a well-established way of governing themselves before the white men ever arrived. Very advanced civilizations that had flourished for centuries. And so obviously, in our modern setting, we see this as a racist worldview. Now, Sitting Bull's conflicting opinion, I think we can see some justification for his view, that white men deface the earth with their buildings and their refuse. They're building things all the time. They're destroying nature. They're building fences. You sense Sitting Bull's view of collective identity. The white man destroy all who are in their path. And so we can certainly be sympathetic with the Native American perspective. Unfortunately for Sitting Bull and the others, the final few years of our period are going to see the final destruction of Native American resistance. As the Indian Wars escalated in the 1880s, we see fewer and fewer examples of continued resistance, although they do persist to the end of our period. In each case, American soldiers eventually hunted down the Native Americans who resisted, in many cases destroying them in battle, in other cases capturing them and confining them to reservations. In one case, Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce and his band were captured attempting to flee to Canada, and Chief Joseph said this, "I am tired of fighting. Our chiefs are killed. It is cold, and we have no blankets. The little children are freezing to death. My people, some of them, have run away to the hills and have no blankets, no food. No one knows where they are, perhaps freezing to death. I want to have time to look for my children and see how many I can find. Maybe I shall find them among the dead. Hear me, my chiefs, I am tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever. And so Native American resistance was gradually worn down. We do have some examples of continued resistance, like the Apaches in the American Southwest, led by Geronimo, who continued fighting with a small band of warriors, about 30 of them, ranging across the West while they were pursued by a small group of American soldiers. This went on for 6 months or more in 1882, until eventually they also wore down and surrendered. The Apaches were rounded up and actually sent to jail in Florida, where hundreds of them died in abysmal conditions. Imagine, they are accustomed to living in the deserts of the American Southwest, and now they are sent to hot and humid and swampy Florida. There was, believe it or not, a public outcry over their mistreatment in this era. Now, as we will see over the next few lectures, this was not an era of public outcry about the well-being of anyone in this country. So their condition must have been truly abysmal to attract any attention at this time. At that point, the several hundred remaining Apaches were sent back to the West, but to Oklahoma. They were never again returned to their homelands in Arizona. Now, there's a final chapter in the resistance of the Native Americans, and it doesn't involve military resistance. In fact, it takes the form of a sort of protest movement on the reservations after Native Americans have surrendered, and it is known as the Ghost Dance. The Ghost Dance was initiated by a shaman or medicine man named Wovoka in 1889. Wovoka had a dream or a vision, and dreams were very important in Native American society. And in his dream, what Wovoka saw was the ghosts or spirits of all the Native Americans who had been killed by white men in the years leading up to this, rising up and returning to the earth to exact their revenge against the white man. Now, this is in some ways a terrible vision from the perspective of white settlers or soldiers. But, of course, we must bear in mind that barring some supernatural event that we've never seen the likes of before, this wasn't really going to happen. The ghosts and spirits of the slain warriors were not going to return and attack the white men. And so the response to this from white soldiers stationed at the reservation has always perplexed me to some extent. White soldiers begin getting more and more anxious as this ghost dance begins to evolve. We see a picture on the screen of what the ghost dance looked like. The Native Americans kind of circling around and trampling the dust in larger and larger numbers. This spread across reservations all across the West during this time. So it would have been surely an impressive sight, but what were the American soldiers afraid of? The spirits coming back? Here are the words of one soldier stationed at the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. "We are at the mercy of these dancers. We need protection, and we need it now." Protection from what, I wonder? In any case, the anxiety mounts on reservations across the West, and the president at that time, the American president Benjamin Harrison, responded by sending several thousand troops to the Pine Ridge Reservation. And what this contributed to was a growing sort of trigger-happy environment in which the American soldiers were more and more tense, the ghost dance escalating in larger and larger numbers, and it seems a violent resolution was almost inevitable. And in fact, this violent resolution occurred in December of 1890 in what we know as the Wounded Knee Massacre. On December 29th, 1890, American soldiers opened fire on a group of Sioux Indians, killing between 200 and 300 in what is known as the Wounded Knee Massacre. The Native Americans in this episode were unarmed. They were engaged in one of these ghost dances, as I've described to you, so it might have been a frightening or intimidating sight, but there was no real threat to American soldiers. At this point, the ghost dance movement itself died out, and all form of resistance on the reservations died as well. This date, December 29th in 1890, marks the end of the Indian Wars and, in essence, the end of any kind of Native American resistance. The words of Black Elk, an Indian visionary, summarize what has happened. The nation's hoop is broken and scattered. There is no longer any center, and the sacred tree is dead. This chart indicates a summary of the events we've been discussing in the previous parts of this lecture. The American West, originally almost completely under the control of Native Americans. You see the map in 1865, California, and other parts of the West sort of gradually falling into the hands of the American government. And by 1880, the reservation system is thoroughly in effect. What you see are a number of very large reservations at that point. But eventually that territory is going to be broken up, as we saw with the Dawes Severalty Act, and eventually we are left with what you see in the final map. As of the year 2000, only very small specks of reservations scattered across the West.